Hi, hello everyone. So here we have a Venn diagram set where we have in August 740 tourists visited Himachal Pradesh. Each tourist went to at least one of the three places out of Rohtang, Shimla and Manali. Okay. So the people visited at least one of these three places. Fine. The following information is known about these tourists. The first is number of tourists visiting Rohtang alone is equal to the number of tourists who also visited Shimla. Okay. So since we have three cities, so let's draw a three-set Venn diagram for this. So this represents people who visited Rohtang, this circle represents people who visited Shimla, and this circle represents people who visited Manali. Fine. So the number of tourists visiting Rohtang alone is equal to tourists who also visited Shimla. Okay. So let's say if number of people visiting Rohtang alone is A, for example, then the number of people who also visited Shimla. Now what does this mean, who also visited Shimla? We have already talked about Rohtang. So here the point is basically talking about those people who have visited Rohtang and also Shimla. Okay. So basically we are talking about these people. So the number of people who have visited only Rohtang, which is this area, is same as the number of people who has visited Rohtang as well as Shimla, which is this area here. Okay. So this total is equal to A. Both these regions together is A. If this is A, both these regions together is A. Fine. Next, look at the next point. The number of tourists visiting Shimla alone is double the number of tourists visiting all the three places. Okay. If the number of people who have visited all the three places is, let's say, X, then the number of people who have visited Shimla alone is 2X. This is 2X over here. Okay, fine. Next, 340 tourists visited Manali. So the number of people who have visited Manali is 340. That means the value of this whole circle will be 340. Cool. Next point is the number of tourists visiting Manali alone is 20 less than the number of tourists visiting Shimla alone. Okay. So Shimla, Manali alone is 20 less than what? Shimla alone. So number of people visiting only Manali will be 2x minus 20. 2x people are visiting only Shimla, so only Manali will be 2x minus 20 here. Fine. Next point. 200 tourists visited 200 tourists who visited Manali also visited at least one more place. Okay. Out of those people who have visited Manali, 200 have visited one more place. That means this region. This region altogether is 200. This region altogether is 200. Now if this region is 200, then obviously this region will be 340 minus 200. That means the value of 2x minus 20 should be equal to 340 minus 200, which is 140. So from here, if you solve, 2x is 160, x comes out to be 80 over here. The value of x comes out to be 80. So if this is 80, this will be 160, and this will be 160 minus 20, 140. This will be 140 over here. Okay. Cool. Fine. And we know this region altogether is 200. Out of these three regions, value of this region is already known, which is 80. So basically this region along with this region, the sum of the values or number of people visiting these two regions is 120. 200 minus 80 is going to be 120 here. Fine. Cool. Let's look at the next point now. Of the three places, maximum number of tourists went to Rohtang. Okay. Maximum number of people went to Rohtang. Fine. So this is the information that we have so far as all the points are concerned. Now there is one more information that we didn't consider yet, which is 740 tourists. The total number of tourists altogether will be 740. All of them went to at least one of these places, right? So the total number of people should be 740 here. Cool. Okay, fine. So let me remove this. Number of people who visited Manali, that means this region we already know is 340 plus only Rohtang, this region is A, plus only Shimla is 160 plus. Now this region, what is this region? This region will be basically, this is total A and this is 80. So A minus 80 this region is. So plus A minus 80. This gives us the total number of tourists, which should be equal to 740 over here. Okay. So we have A plus A is 2A, 160 minus 80 is 80, and 340 goes that side, which becomes 400. So 2A is 320, so A comes out to be 160. A comes out to be 160 here. That means if A is 160, number of people visiting only Rohtang is 160, and this becomes 160 minus 80. So this becomes 80 here. Fine. So this basically gives us the number of tourists who have visited which particular city, except for these two regions. We have figured out the value for all the other regions. Okay. Now let us look at the questions. The first question is, based on the information given above, the minimum number of tourists visiting both Rohtang and Manali but not Shimla is. Okay. So Rohtang and Manali but not Shimla is basically this region here, and we have to figure out the minimum value of this region. But before we minimize this region here, what we need to do is we need to maximize the number of tourists visiting Rohtang, or basically the number of tourists visiting Rohtang is maximum. That we have to ensure. Ensuring this particular thing, we have to minimize the value of this green region. Okay. So let's see the number of tourists visiting Rohtang is how many. Currently the number of tourists visiting Rohtang is 160 plus 80 plus 80 plus, let's say this region is B and this region is A for the time being. So the number of tourists visiting Rohtang is 160 plus 80 240 plus 80 320 plus B 320 plus B. Then the number of tourists visiting Shimla is 160 plus 80 240 240 plus 80 is 320 320 plus A 320 plus A, and the number of tourists visiting Manali is 340. The maximum number of people should visit Rohtang. From here 320 plus B should be greater than 320 plus A, or effectively B should be greater than A. And we also know that B plus A is equal to 120. Sum of these two regions is 120, right? So if B has to be greater than A, that means the minimum value of B should be 61. The minimum value of B should be 61. Then only the number of tourists visiting Rohtang would be the maximum. Okay. That means the minimum value of this green region is 61 here. So the answer to the first question is 61. Okay. Now coming to the next question, here we have, which of the following additional information would enable to find the exact number of tourists visiting various places? Okay. So out of these four options, which option will help us finalize the exact number of tourists visiting various places? So far we know we only don't know the values of A and B. So we are basically looking for some data that will be able to we can use to find out the values of A and B over here. Okay. So let's look at the options here. First option is 400 tourists are visiting Rohtang. Now the number of people visiting Rohtang is 320 plus B, right? If this is equal to 400, we would be able to find out the value of B. And once we find out the value of B, we can also find out the value of A, and hence we would be able to figure out all the tourists visiting various places. Hence option A is itself the correct answer. You don't have to actually go and check the other options even. First option itself is the correct answer. Option D cannot be the correct answer. Option D says no need for any additional information. We already know all the information, but we don't know the values of A and B yet. So option D cannot be the correct answer. The right answer is option A over here. Fine. Now let's look at the next question. Next year, these tourists decided to visit the same places as they did last year, with the following exceptions. Okay. The tourists who visited all the three places visited only 2 of the 3 places. Okay. As a result, fine. There were 80 tourists who visited all the 3 places last year, But out of these 80 tourists, there are some tourists who are, all these 80 tourists are not going to visit all the three places. They are going to visit exactly two of the three places. Out of the three places, they are going to visit two. And which two? Let's see the information given ahead. As a result, 20 tourists opted out of Manali. Okay, so out of these 80 tourists, 20 of them did not go to Manali. They did not go to Manali. That means they visited only Rohtang and Shimla. So 20 tourists shifted from this region to this region over here. Okay, so we will have a total of 100 people visiting only Rohtang and Shimla next year. Fine. Then 20 opted out of Shimla. Fine. 20 opted out of Shimla. That means 20 shifted to only Rohtang and Manali. So we have 20 shifting here, and sorry, the remaining ones visiting all the three places opted out of Rohtang. Now what is the remaining people now? Out of 80, 20 shifted to this particular region and 20 shifted to this particular region. So 40 people have already shifted. So remaining 40 will shift to this particular region here. Only two places, which is Shimla and Manali. So now we will have zero number of people visiting all the three places. Out of 80, 20 have shifted here, 20 have shifted here, and the remaining 40 have shifted over here. Okay? Now, which of the following statements then necessarily follows? Now, out of these four statements, which of them is correct? We have to figure that out. Now, the lowest number of tourists now is in Manali. Okay. Now, the number of tourists, let's try to figure out the number of tourists in each of these places. Now, one thing that you should keep in mind is this point will not apply for the next year. This point was only for the first year. That is, the maximum number of tourists visited Rohtang was applicable for first year. You don't have to apply this to the next year. Fine. So the number of tourists who are visiting Rohtang will be 160 plus 100, which is 260 plus 20 plus B. So this comes out to be 260 plus 20, 280 plus B. The number of tourists visiting Rohtang is 280 plus B. Okay. Similarly, the number of tourists visiting Shimla will be, let me clear this, 160 plus 100, which is 260, 260 plus 40 plus A. So this comes out to be 300 plus A. Okay. And finally, the number of tourists visiting Manali will be 140 plus 40, which is 180, 180 plus 20, which is 200, 200 plus A plus B, 200 plus A plus B. Now we already know A plus B is 120, so this comes out to be 320 here. Okay. So now let's look at the options. Which of the four options given is correct? First, the lowest number of tourists is now in Manali. Now before we verify the options, we know B should be greater than or equal to 61. We had figured this out already in the first question. B should be greater than or equal to 61 because the maximum number of tourists should visit Rohtang during the first year. Okay, fine. So from here, if B is greater than equal to 61, that means the number of tourists visiting Rohtang next year should be greater than or equal to 280 plus 61, which is 341. If B is greater than or equal to 61 and A plus B we know is 120, that means A should be less than or equal to 59. That means the number of tourists visiting Shimla should be less than or equal to 359. And for Manali it is fixed 320. Now let's look at the options. First option, the lowest number of tourists visited is now in Manali. Okay, so the lowest number of tourists visiting is now in Manali. We cannot be sure about it because for Shimla also the lowest number of people can be, the number of tourists visiting can be least for Shimla also. If A is, let's say, 0, if A is 0, this becomes 300 and hence becomes the least. Okay, so A cannot be necessarily true. Second option, more tourists are now in Rohtang as compared to Shimla. Okay. As of now, if we consider these values, B is 61 and A is 59, in that case the number of tourists in Shimla is higher than the number of tourists in Rohtang. Okay, so even second option is not necessarily true. Fine. Uh, Third option, more tourists are now in Manali as compared to Shimla. We have already seen this may be true, but if A is equal to 59, more tourists will be in Shimla, and hence option 3 also cannot be always true. Fine. More tourists are now in Shimla, now in Manali, right? This may not always be true. If A is 59, then more tourists would be in Shimla instead of Manali. So even third option is not correct. That means the correct answer here is option D, none of the above. Fine. Now coming to this final question, fourth question. This part of the question is same as the information given in the third question. So this part we have already figured out, that out of 80 people here, next year 20 would shift in this region, 20 in this region, and 40 in this particular region. Okay. Let's look at the next part. Apart from the old tourists, some new tourists also visited Himachal Pradesh next year in August. Each of these new tourists visited only one place, such that the number of tourists visiting each of the three places alone became identical. Okay, so what's happening here is, apart from this shifting, there are few more tourists who are going to visit exactly one of these three places, such that what happens is the number of tourists visiting exactly one of these three places becomes equal. Number of people visiting only Rohtang is same as number of people visiting only Shimla, which is same as number of people visiting only Manali. Okay. Now what's happening is, the next is, at this point it was also found that the number of tourists visiting Rohtang and Shimla was same as the number of tourists visiting Rohtang and Manali. Now Rohtang and Shimla is this part here, but since this is 0, let's not consider this. So Rohtang and Shimla is same as Rohtang and Manali, this part here. So this is 100, hence this should also be 100. If this is 100, that means the value of B is 80. The value of B becomes 80, and since B plus A is 120, A becomes 40. A becomes 40. So if B is 80, 80 plus 20, this region is 100, this region becomes 100, and A is 40, 40 plus 40, this region becomes 80 here. Okay, so this is the information that we have so far. Now the question is, which of the places now has the highest number of tourists? Okay, which place has the highest number of tourists is what we have to figure out. Now the number of people who have visited Rohtang is X plus 100 plus 100. So X plus 200. Rohtang has X plus 200 people. Similarly for Shimla it is X plus 100 plus 80. So X plus 180, and for Manali it will become X plus 80 plus 100. X plus again 180. So out of these three places, maximum number of tourists would be visiting Rohtang next year. Okay, whatever the value of X is, X will be some positive integer. So the number of tourists visiting next year would be highest in again Rohtang. Hence the answer is option B here. Okay, so that's it for this set. Thank you.